Let's see. Let's press that button, which means that I think it has happened. I think we are indeed live. Iain, hello. Everyone, we have Professor Iain Docherty is here.
Hi, Gareth. How you doing?
Hello. Right, so I'm going to press. What am I going to press? I'm going to press a variety of buttons. Firstly, I'm going to say I'm going to go. Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to crack straight into the episode because we've got a lot to get through and it's quite a tight one. So, first of all, Iain is in the background. Tell us about the sound balance. People in the chat. Is it okay? We're going to look at the COVID stats to start with, and it's a very quick glance at the stats because we've got some other interesting data to look at. But first of all, cycling is nice. So the weather relative to this time in pre-COVID levels, I'm guessing, is a bit nicer because these are all relative figures, of course. But actually, we're at over 140% of cycling, kind of a fairly nice sort of lump at the moment, which is quite nice. Road vehicles, as ever, road usage. Different, but about the level it was pre-COVID, even if the patterns have slightly changed. Bus usage is rising again a little bit, so there's a little bit of a creep upwards again. So bus usage probably sitting around 80%. Rail, pleasingly enough, is now at, or was at the last time that it had a confirmed number, is at 85% of pre-COVID levels. So I thought we'd be reaching a bit of an asymptote at 80%, but actually it's continuing to climb, which is nice. And that's despite the fact that we're still running reduced timetables, particularly in on the southern network in London. They're running vastly reduced timetables, and so that my perception is that that's going to have an impact. But anyway, so that's quite interesting, really. And what ties that? So that 85% is interesting for a number of reasons. I've got some data here, which is through from the recovery of revenue, the overall big picture of revenue recovery. So this isn't ridership, this is revenue. And long distance revenue recovery is at 91%. Regional revenue recovery is 88%. London Southeastern revenue recovery is at 77%. So that's, the total there is 84%. So interestingly, this wasn't the case before, but it's looking like revenue and ridership are starting to match back in line again, which for everything else I'd been seeing previously wasn't the case. That ridership had climbed much more rapidly than revenue had climbed. So that I find very interesting, actually. The next slide, and Iain, jump in if you've got some thoughts on any of this, but the next slide I think is probably the most interesting one, which is a breakdown of revenue recovery by market sector. So the red stuff, kind of this end down here, is commuting, the green here is leisure, blue is business travel, and then the orange is is just general within London kind of transport. What's quite interesting here is firstly we're looking at revenue for short distance leisure travel. It's way up 120%, 100% for the black line, by the way, is the total industry figure. And this is interestingly, I think this analysis is a little bit further behind than the revenue statistics I gave before, because you can see this black line is down at about 70% rather than being where it is now, which is 84%. So I think these are slightly older than the numbers I gave you before. But anyway, it's just interesting to see how much leisure is recovered well. Commuting, long distance commuting has actually recovered pretty well too, which is quite interesting, I think. But you see that the commuting to and from London and the short distance business travel and long distance business travel particularly have taken a big hit. Iain, does this kind of match your understanding given the statistics you've been collecting?
Yeah, it does, Gareth. So the business travel stuff is no surprise at all, because lots of firms have begun to ask themselves a question about why did they pay hundreds of pounds to ferry people around for short meetings that we can do like this?
Yeah.
And I don't think that's ever coming back, frankly, because there's no business case for it. The commuting, we know that people that used the railways before the pandemic were much more likely to be in white-collar jobs in city centres and more likely to be able to determine, at least in part, their own working pattern as we go back to the office. Yep. So none of that surprises me. I mean, I'm actually, like you, more surprised by the pace of the recovery recently, because I thought it had got stuck a bit as well. But
yeah, me too.
Let's see how that pans out.
Yeah, it might be a bit of a bump, and it might level out a little lower again. But I'm pleased to see the obviously both of us are big public transport advocates. It's good to see that ridership climbing more quickly. But yeah, I agree. I'm a bit wary of overselling the fact that it's going to be all back to 100% at any point soon, because things have changed. Anyway, that's the thing. I think it's a discussion that we'll have, I think, at a future point, and we'll talk about that later on. Spoilers, everyone. But yes, it's very interesting to see. It's worth saying that particular train operators. So, for example, LNE are, I think, way above pre-COVID level ridership now. Revenue not quite to the same level, but certainly above pre-COVID levels. EMR, so East Midlands, are Harry Tance has just said they're reporting 90% of pre-COVID passenger numbers. So there's a mixed, even within the long distance. Avanti are quite a lot lower. So there's even within the kind of the long distance leisure services or the long distance train operators, there's quite a mixed pattern. Anyway, that's quite interesting. Now, I'm going to roar through the news so we can get started because it's already 7:10. So Andy Burnham has tweeted. This was interesting. This got lots of people chatting, and the takes were a mixture. So, obviously, this is a bit disingenuous because £369 is not what most people would spend to get from Manchester down to London or vice versa, and and back. And also that's a walk-up fare, whereas these are advanced flight fares. However, it's not a bad tweet. It makes a fine point. Like the people often do this. There's like, and I get angry because lots of adenoidal people come in and say, "Oh well, including and sometimes it's so egregious that even I get involved in it. It's like, well, it's not really a fair comparison, and then don't really back up with. And I always try to do this if people are asking me to refute this, is then come up with no, but rail fares are too expensive. This idea of this commercial competitiveness that allows you to have such high and simultaneously low fares is not a particularly accessible thing to my mind. So lots of people were being angry about the Burnham tweet without then kind of acknowledging that rail fares are too high across the UK. Relatively speaking, they are off-putting to a lot of passengers. And indeed, the system is too complicated. Blah, blah, blah. We've discussed this at length. So anyway, Burnham tweeted. Next. Very quick news. Yeah, the Pendolinos are in the process of getting refurbished, which is nice. They look, basically the same, frankly. It's a little smarter looking, and all the tired seats are looking a bit less red and a bit more blue. But, it's smart enough, but it's not hugely dramatic. It is still the same train. Anyway, so that's happening. What else? Oh, yeah, strike. The strike is getting closer. This is Network Rail, a massive Network Rail strike going on because it's not really, it's a bit of a shame. Network Rail are kind of in the middle of this because actually it's really government that are forcing Network Rail to enact massive cuts to its headcount, including within safety critical roles like maintenance. And so the unions are quite rightly responding robustly. And I have to say, Network Rail are not doing a great job. Network Rail, certainly at the senior levels, are really not doing a very good job of coming out of their response to the potential strike very well, including a director of comms at Network Rail who made people very angry for coming out with some strange comments about people people should probably have worked harder at school if they wanted better pay, was one quote, and then another one. Well, the next quote I think was probably the most excruciating. Obviously, the only pay equality is socialism. So this quote was the person adding that the alternative to such pay inequality is socialism, where you don't have pay differences like this. No, it isn't really, but anyway. Noting, sadly again, there's not much evidence of successful, fair and open socialist countries in the world. Anyway, just don't say this, folks. This isn't the right thing to put onto a Yammer chat within Network Rail to a lot of very worried staff. They're not covering themselves in glory at the moment. Yes, sour times for Portishead. Yes, the government has once again, and this is I always like to have a news article that leads into the core of the piece, and this is this is a good example. Why on earth is central government having anything to do with a reopening of a railway line down in the southwest of England to the point where they can delay it by successive years? They've delayed their decision back to 2023, so it's another year of delay. The submission first happened in November 2019. That was when the DCO, the Development Consent Order, was submitted. It's just absolutely appalling that central government has anything to do with such a trivial bit of infrastructure. Just why on earth is central government involved in it at all? And I think this leads quite neatly into, very neatly in fact, into our discussion that we're going to have, Ian. And indeed, relates back to an episode previously, not so long ago, with John Stone, about the fact that my kind of one of my big drums I like to bang is that it is impossible for public transport to get better without the UK decentralising power. Fundamentally impossible. poor Ian's been stuck on the other side while I've ranted about the news. Ian, I'll be with you in moments, but it only remains for me to introduce the show. Everyone, welcome to tonight's Rail Natter. And as the Intercity 225 fades away, there it goes. We're going to put up a lovely picture of Stirling with the Wallace Monument in the background there. I'm very fond of this campus. Ian, first of all, let's do this so that people can actually see you, see that you're real and exist and aren't a series of sound bites that I've cobbled together in the background to pretend I have a guest. Ian, welcome to Railnar. It's lovely to have you.
Thanks, Gav. Great to be here. I should say that picture on the campus is probably the best example of the final mile problem about how to get from the local railway station to where you actually want to be that I know of anywhere in this island. But there you go. Challenged by when I used to work at the National High Speed Rail College in Doncaster, which was similarly nightmarish. A high speed rail college, and getting from my. The joke was that commuting from York to Doncaster, two cities next to each other, is almost impossible because most trains go through Doncaster without stopping. And then getting the bus from the station to it's just yes. So it's ironic that yourself in a department that deals with a lot of transport planning as a perfect example of the challenge of public transport at its footstep. So Ian, tell us about what you do and tell us about what you do at the University of Stirling and some of the other things you get involved in. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dennis. So, crikey, that shows you how long a day it's been for me. I'm the Dean of something called the Institute for Advanced Studies at Stirling. So we've got two roles. We are the doctoral college for the university. So I have oversight of all of our PhD students and other doctoral candidates across our degrees. And we're also where researchers from our 5 faculties come together to do interesting interdisciplinary research. So I get the fun task of introducing scientists to historians and things like that. And out of those conversations come interesting innovations and some good work. My own background is I'm kind of interdisciplinary tart in the social sciences. So my first degree was in geography, then I did a PhD in geography and economic social history. I'm really a political scientist and I've worked in business schools for most of my career. So I kind of float around across the disciplines in the social sciences and some of the humanities. Transport has always been my research interest, although clearly I've got other interests in wider issues about regional planning and the economy. And most recently was part of a merry band of non-economists who were given some money by the research councils to think about productivity from a non-economic standpoint, and so think through some of the issues that we'll no doubt talk today about what things like investment in transport infrastructure really does for the economy in comparison to what people say it might do.
Interesting, yeah. So I mean, the people who comment best on transport and understand transport are generally generalists, actually, or certainly people who have a broad understanding of political context. I think I see lots of people lots of people talk about and spend a lot of time talking about rail and talk about transport, whilst just entirely avoiding political context, as if that is essentially any sort of meaningful analysis. So, it is certainly.
Well, there's a lot of politics about in devolution, which we may well talk about. So that's clearly an issue which has been important up here, shall we say?
Absolutely, yeah. And so we've kind of interacted on Twitter for a very long time and kind of discussed transport policy.
I usually manage to call you Gareth on Twitter. You're obviously more awake when I tend to do that rather than today. So.
That's okay. I've received 2 emails today from people calling me Dennis. It's a consequence of having 2 first names. I'll give you that. So let's get our miniaturized faces up. The last time we kind of had a lengthy discussion was actually apologies for my face. Was actually when we both I had the privilege of speaking at the Transport Select Committee. Me, a bit of a faker, and 3 other actual professional academics. It was a slightly surreal experience when I was being referred to as an academic and some such, and I have absolutely no expertise within what I was talking about. But I was, it was a good session. I thought it'd be worth just for 5 minutes having a bit of a debrief because, it was an interesting session. What was your perception of firstly, kind of whether there'll be any beneficial consequence of the session, but also how it went and some of the questions. What were you thinking in that session?
Well, let's answer those in reverse order.
Yeah.
Will there be any beneficial outcomes of these sessions? That's a bit of a big ask for lots of these things because, of course, politics that we've talked about intervenes. So, let's see, there's a lot of politics around when it comes to the IRP and HS2 and the subjects that we were talking about. So, yeah, let's see how that pans out. I was pleasantly surprised by it, I have to say. I thought it was pretty constructive. I thought some of the conversation, particularly about the real value of investment in high-speed lines and the impact they might have if they were managed properly in an economic development sense, that was a better discussion than I expected us to have, particularly given the number of relatively recent Tory entrants that are in the committee.
Yes.
So, I was pleasantly surprised by the tone of that debate, and it didn't really default to the worst of the political punch and judy that we've had over HS2 in particular. So, yeah, I thought it was quite good, and I thought the chair did a good job in our session in particular, moving it on and getting across lots of the key issues. Actually.
Yeah, I have to agree. I'd watched the previous session and was pretty disheartened after it. In fact, I couldn't watch the whole thing because it was so disheartening. The Burnhams session, I just found it really difficult to watch, and Transport for the North was there as well. And I was worrying that the session would be the same for us, but it wasn't actually. It was really constructive, and I was pleased that Hugh did the job that he did as chair. Yeah, definitely. So let's get rid of my oral face, or at least having two of my faces on the screen at once because it's dreadful. It's a lovely 156. Actually, I've cheated because this is a 156 in it's in the National Express the National Express ScotRail colours, but actually it's got the first ScotRail stickers on it. So I was trying to get the nice National Express sort of 3. Anyway, I'm waffling. Basically, let's get on with chatting about privatisation. And actually, I think the first thing to talk about, and I'm going to be referring back to a piece that, some discussion points that you've kind of discussed elsewhere, actually. So we'll refer back to those. But it's talking about the aim. I think the first thing to talk about is what was the aim? What do you perceive as, and what was the intended aim of privatisation? Feels like a good starting point.
Yeah, well, there are several answers to that one, aren't there? Depending on the level of political cynicism that you want to underpin the analysis. And I should say that my very good friend and close colleague John Shaw at Plymouth wrote the book about British rail privatisation, which is still the one which I think is the go-to text on what really happened at the time, because John had access to the people who were really thinking that through in the key period in the early 90s when everything was actually happening. So, well, the cynical political answer to that, of course, is that the Tory government of the time, post-Black Wednesday, probably had a moment where it realised it was in its last term and it wanted to slash and burn and privatise everything that was left that hadn't been done. Didn't quite, get as far with some others as they'd hoped, but that was the railways were one that they wanted to do. A slightly more sophisticated answer, I think, is that there were people in government at the time, both on the political side but also in the civil service, who took a particular long-run view of the railways, thought they were in terminal decline, wanted to avoid another beaching and another Serpil, because remember that was only 10 years previously, and thought in a fairly orthodox way at the time that the injection of private capital, probably more accurately letting the operators borrow in the market to invest in infrastructure and rolling stock and services, would save the railways from that kind of decline, and a dose of entrepreneurial spirit would help in marketing and attract passengers back. So there's all that kind of standard story, and I think that lots of people really did believe that at the time. So that would be my view on why privatisation really happened. You can take your pick about whether it was a success or not. It very quickly unravelled, of course, particularly on the infrastructure side. We know that passenger and freight numbers, but passenger numbers increased substantially. So did public subsidy, of course. So, what was the point of it? And there was a few. The generous interpretation was it was saving the system from terminal decline. Did it work? Well, at least it succeeded in saving the railways from terminal decline. But whether it was better than any of the alternatives we could have come up with, either in terms of the form of privatisation that we had, because of course it didn't have to be that kind of ultra fragmented system that Christopher Foster was fondest of, or whether we'd had some kind of different model of state ownership. Well, who knows?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things I always find surprising is that firstly, you can compare I often make the point, and I did this in my, right back in one of my earliest episodes about the advanced passenger train, and I tried to answer the question, if the APT had succeeded, what might have happened? Often, macro effects just dwarf some of these, even though there was such a radical difference in the way the railway was structured, actually, you can look to Northern Ireland to see a system that remained in state operation, and their relative percentage increase in ridership is the same as it was in GB. So, and the other thing, of course, is that isn't mentioned often, is that the general trend in increasing ridership started in the mid '80s. Actually, so, the kind of the early sectorization was quite successful in actually reversing some of the general declines. And there was a drop, quite a steep drop after the early '90s recession, but kind of you'd expect there to be, given the state Britain was in the '80s. Whereas if you look at the recession in the big recession in 2008, that drop, you can see a slowdown, but the drop is much less pronounced because people had quite a long period of better living conditions and better standards of living. So again, the macro effects are bigger than the railway. We like to be insular in the rail industry and think that everything we do has all dramatic changes, but actually the world is bigger than us in our little industry.
I'd agree with you, and these effects are often orders of magnitude bigger as well than little tweaks that happen within any economic sector that you talk about. And so if you look at the level of restructuring that went on in the British economy about how we earned our money and where people lived and where they worked, that tells you a lot of the story about what happened on the railways, irrespective of ownership or governance. Absolutely. Yeah,
there were the huge shifts in sort of urbanisation reversing. London, for goodness sake, the population started climbing, and that tallies with these huge macro effects, as you say, that dwarf any little changes we could make in our funny little industry. So privatisation, there's a bit of context. So the next question then, which ties into the story that we're telling, the story about Scotland's railways, is did that privatisation, the Railways Act 1993, did it account for any sort of devolution, not even just for Scotland, but even perhaps to the cities? Because, of course, the passenger transport executives existed. How did any form of devolution, but obviously focusing on Scotland, did it exist at all within that act?
That's an easy question. No, it didn't.
Okay.
No account for it at all. And a really interesting thought experiment, by the way, is to think about what might have happened if, as most people expected, Labour had won the 1992 general election. Some form of devolution to Scotland and Wales had occurred at that point, and we'd inherited BR as it was immediately before privatisation, which, of course, in Scotland's case, was a vertically integrated operation that was responsible for just about everything other than cross-border services. So, what was happening then was that there was a series of sort of parallel politics that was going on. So up here, post-92, there was a real, and I think, profound shift in public attitude towards devolution, which had been kind of gently in favour but sceptical up until then, and after the 92 election, you began to see things like street demos, not hardcore nationalists either, who were pretty upset about the result and the fact that the Tories, of course, had done really badly in Scotland in 92, and that things had to change. But in a legislative way, lots of things happened here that didn't take account of that. Another really important one, which is relevant to the transport debate, is the reform of local government in Scotland that happened in 1995, and the legislation was sort of coterminous with the railways legislation that abolished the two-tier structure that we'd had since the 70s, and which Strathclyde PTE was based on. So there was lots of things happening there which were pretty straight ahead Tory government intervention, and were really redolent of the debate at the time about who are you to be doing this to us when we didn't vote for you. So there was really quite an interesting political context to a lot of that. But short answer, that was a very long answer when I could have just said no.
Yeah. So actually, an interesting thing that if I bring up is actually is some of the stuff that was going on sort of within the railway sphere related to devolution post 1993. So I don't know whether you want to kind of walk us through sort of this sequence of...
Yeah, I suppose people outside Scotland might not know some of this history. So one thing that's important to realise is that devolution to Scotland is what we call legislative devolution. So essentially what happened in 1999 was that the Scottish Parliament was created, but it assumed democratic responsibility for administration that was already devolved.
Yeah.
So the Scottish Office had gradually accumulated powers, in particular since the 1930s. And lots of domestic policy in Scotland, particularly in the kind of socio-economic domain, of which transport was one, was increasingly devolved in an administrative sense from the 30s. Big dose of that in the 60s as well, actually. And then, so by the time 1999 came around, there was actually quite a lot of domestic policy that was run by Scottish ministers, who were then just the members of the UK government appointed by, or in the normal process, but nonetheless they acted and promoted Scottish legislation, and that went through the Commons. So what happened was that then moved to the Scottish Parliament, but the actual responsibilities in terms of competence that the Scottish Parliament was given at that point really wasn't different at all from what had gone before. So that's generally not understood, and that's why we had this thing called the McLeish Settlement, because of course the railways were not devolved. It was not clear how devolution of the railways would be achieved quickly, particularly because unpicking the financial structure of the industry was going to be so difficult, and devolution didn't attempt to talk about the way that Scotland was funded at all in the first round. So it was kind of put in the too difficult basket. McLeish, of course, became First Minister, who was the junior minister in the government at Westminster when devolution went through, came up with this settlement compromise, as you might like to call it. And that was essentially about giving an advisory role for ministers in the new Scottish Executive, now called the Scottish Government, and give guidance to the SRA. So it was very minimal. And then after that, we had the 2005 Railways Act, and that was quite an interesting period, to put it mildly. I was the special advisor to the Scottish Parliament Committee that was tasked with reviewing the legislation. That was rushed through just before the 2005 general election, if you might remember. And that's kind of similar to some of the other devolved settlements, the Merseyside idea, where it's not just central government in Whitehall or Westminster that is the franchising authority. So then after that, Transport Scotland, which was being set up at that point, became the franchising authority for the Scottish services, both ScotRail and the Sleeper, of course.
Yep.
And there was really quite a controversial discussion about how the devolution of infrastructure funding would be taken forward. So that was put into the Scottish block. Effectively, the Scottish Parliament has to spend, but we could have a whole episode about whether or how that calculation was done, and whether it actually reflects what's democratically correct, the Barnett formula, what the railways in Scotland look like, etc.
Sorry, Railnatter hates the Barnett formula. We're not Barnett formula fans.
By 2014, and the Smith Commission was the commission that Cameron announced the morning after the India Ref, of course, the debate here had moved to, so why is the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, responsible for rail franchising? Why does it fund it? But it's obliged to have a particular kind of franchising competition that only a private sector company can operate. And that reflects the fact that railways, to use the legislative jargon, are mostly reserved matters, actually. So the key legislative and legal framework of railway operation, according to government documents, and there's the great House of Commons library document on this, it sets out position really nicely. They are actually still quite reserved because of the nature of Network Rail in particular and the way the system is funded. But it became a political anomaly here that Scotland was obliged to have a private sector operator when there was something of a political consensus that we'd rather have a public sector one, which I'm sure you'd like to come back to and ask me why that's the case, surely.
Yeah. So, thanks for that summary. You'll be pleased that Lin Man Fu has just quoted Ron Davis at us, which is good because that's a quote that I think you use quite regularly.
Devolution is a process, not an event.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Lynn. I think
I think I said in that piece actually that the railways are probably the best example of where devolution has in fact been a process rather than an event of any area of policy in Scotland today.
And as we'll get to shortly, this is a process that's going to run long. It's not getting wrapped up anytime soon. So right, okay, excellent. That was good. So and kind of on that theme, in fact it's not that many slides away, because I think pretty much now is how we're going to discuss about how that's going to continue looking. The fact that we have got a situation where, to a greater or lesser extent, yes, there is devolution continuing to happen within the broader rail organisations. Network Rail's regions and routes are sort of getting a bit more power, but at the same time, there is a new and massive re-centralisation effort going on, not just within the railways, but central government continues to centralise more and more power, and not to DfT but to Treasury. So within that context, I thought I'd kind of break down, and I suppose the key thing with this is the combat of Great British Railways versus increased devolved powers, and how this ties together. And I thought I'd pick a little microcosm. I'll briefly grab the mic off you, Ian, and just sort of do a little microcosm. And you might want to. This might be a humorous way for us to look at the bigger picture and some of the more perhaps dramatic consequences that GBR might have. So there's one quote that I pulled out when we were looking at the GBR report, whenever it was, over a year ago now, quite a while ago. And actually, there's a section of this which is one line which I felt potentially captures the attitude of GBR to the devolved rail operations, this is about branding. Variants to the national brand will be developed to reflect the English regions, Scotland and Wales, while emphasising that the railway is one network serving the whole of Great Britain. Okay. Now this is interesting because Scotland has a very well recognised railway branding. It's actually a very recognised brand. I think it's a successful brand. I think much like Wales's new unified transport branding, I think the ScotRail branding is very good. And what's GBR going to do? I mean, there is the opportunity to tweak, to get the double arrow back in there. And the double arrow is still used extensively across Scotland. But are we going to see a situation where GBR, this is just the microcosm of branding, let alone all of the other critical issues across the industry? Are we going to see a situation where GBR starts elbowing in and using the fact that it actually will have reserve powers to start changing things in Scotland? Will it be saying, actually, get rid of all your current branding? We want there to be a full GBR brand across the whole of Scotland. So I think that's an interesting microcosm, and it's probably one of the smaller, I think it's still important, but one of the smaller questions that the transition team are going to have to deal with. So yeah, Ian, what are your kind of thoughts on GBR versus Scotland and ScotRail?
Well, at the risk
start.
of being impolite, my reading of the GBR paper was that they hadn't really thought about this very much at all, frankly. It's probably in the too difficult basket. I know if you speak to colleagues on Merseyside, where they've got different political contexts, but actually operationally similar kinds of devolved issues, they would tell you, I think, that they've not got a clue what GBR means for them either, in terms of what's really important. Branding, interesting point, of course, is that the ScotRail branding and the saltire devices that were used predate the SNP government. A lot of people conflate that with the politics, but it was actually Tavi Scott, he was the Lib Dem Transport Minister at the time. He was really up for that and thought, that was a way to create a coherent brand for the railways and start to reposition them in Scotland as forward-looking and dynamic and all that stuff. And Transport Scotland did a really good job at the time in putting that together. And you've shown some interesting liveries that have adorned trains in Scotland in earlier slides. I'm one of those people who thinks that, and it's a tiny issue in many respects, but hasn't graphic design and livery been one of the absolute failures of privatisation? We've forgotten to be in the book, but all this kind of stuff. So I think the ScotRail brand we've got is really good.
Yeah.
Interestingly, of course, one word that doesn't appear in the final iteration of that was it was originally going to be Scotland's National Railway, but that disappeared because that was seen as being too political.
That's interesting because that makes Scotland's Railways.
I'm sure there'd be a big red line.
Yeah. Scotland's Railway always seems a bit weird as a subtitle because it's like, well, I mean, yeah, that is what ScotRail means, but that makes more sense.
But that quote that you put up from GBR says that there needs to be one national network serving Great Britain. Any political scientist would tell you that that's a non sequitur anyway.
Yes,
and reflects the politics of the authors, but there you go.
Yep.
So I mean, the answer is nobody knows. One senior wag in the industry I know well up here said that he expects it to amount to nothing else than an instruction to fly the Union flag on major stations.
Yeah, that's a fair point. It's worth also highlighting that that actually it's a case of Scottish, and not the first and certainly won't be the last, a case of Scottish policy steering UK policy or GB policy or certainly Westminster policy, which is ScotRail was the first of the privatised train operators to have a branding that was developed to transcend the private company owning and operating or operating the fleet, not owning the fleet. And then, of course, that became an idea that the DfT started liking quite a lot, and we saw. I think GWR was possibly the first of the, and then it followed that we started seeing several. There were they abandoned the, and quite rightly, it was always daft that you would repaint trains after 3 years. It was just a doolally, wasteful and confusing policy. But anyway, so yeah, Scotland again sort of pointing out that the sort of strangeness of Westminster policy, not for the first time. So yeah. GBR is going to be interesting, and I've got some interesting conversations booked in actually with some interesting people directly related to some of this, which I probably won't be able to report back on in a public forum anytime soon. But I'm certainly keeping a very close eye on this. Actually, branding is important, and for me, it's almost a canary in the coal mine actually. So I'm keeping an eye on how this develops.
Seeing as we're here and we're talking about branding, and I'm a massive fan of the design manual and all the rest of it, please can we preserve the sanctity of the double arrow and not mess around with it? for short-term political considerations. You know of which I speak.
Absolutely. Well, you might notice there's a thing behind me up here. This is you can't see the top of it, but that is Wallagram's corporate identity manual, hardbound copy, which is very nice, and I'd strongly recommend people take
it. Yeah, I've got one in my office as well. If I were there, I could have held mine up to go slow.
Yeah, absolutely. There is some good, and there's discussion about branding that I'm going to have in a few episodes generally, because there is some good stuff happening about rail branding, both kind of across GB and certainly within sort of the devolved areas. That's a discussion for another time, though. So. Oh, yeah, you and I both care about branding because not only is it interesting and nice to look at, but also it's really important. Actually, it's really important to a load of things, including ridership and how much people are interested in and have ownership over their public transport systems. So, next question with said branding in the background, which I really do think it looks great, by the way. I think the ScotRail branded trains look fantastic. They really do.
It's interesting. It's better from a distance than it is from is close up as well.
Yes.
So if you get to see the whole train set from a distance, so one of my favourite money shots is if you're driving down the M80 under Castlecarry Viaduct in the Glasgow main line, and you see a 7 or 8 car 385 train that's done up with that. And of course, the clever part of the branding is you'll notice that the arrows at each end become the Saltire when the units are joined together. You see the whole train set, you get to see just how clever it is.
It's an arrow at each end and Saltires in the middle. It's very clever, very simple, but actually really effective. Anyway, this has become branding natter, everyone. So a bit about what the hell is going on, because there's going to be plenty of people watching who kind of are aware that this has happened. Exactly 25 years of private operation now switched back to national ownership. But why has it happened? What's the story? How has it happened? Why has it happened? Tell us the story, Ian. We shall sit back comfortably, and you can tell us the tale.
Oh yeah, thanks a lot for that invitation. I should say to people, of course, that I was both a non-executive director of Transport Scotland for almost 5 years, and then of the ScotRail operating company under its previous incumbent. So I have seen a lot of this close up, and people often say a lot of it's my fault, so I should probably put that on the table for a start. Why is it returned to state operation? My take on this is that one thing you have to understand about the current Scottish Government is that it is so wedded to its main purpose in life, which of course is constitutional change, that when it comes to doing the task of domestic governance, it's desperate to be perceived as competent above anything else, because political scientists amongst us will know the importance of competence in being able to have a long-run government. And of course, the SNP administration has now been in power in various forms since 2007. So if you take together its project, its desire for competence, what it desperately needs is domestic policy issues not to cause problems, not to be on the front pages of the papers, and not to give the media a stick to hit the government over. Now, what I think is interesting about the privatised operation of ScotRail is that it did a lot of those things and made life very difficult for the government for a number of reasons. So, those of us who understand the industry know that the way the franchise model works is that the operators are incentivized to spend lots of money in enhancement improvement at the beginning of the franchise period, and then they reap the revenue benefit late on in the franchise period. So there's a kind of hockey stick curve issue that goes on. So in the last round, the 7 years of the Abellio franchise, there was a hell of a lot of money that was poured into modernisation of the network in Scotland, particularly the Edinburgh-Glasgow electrification and upgrade, etc., etc. But it was very disruptive, much more disruptive than people expected it to be. We had our own version of, although not quite as bad, of the timetable change issues that plagued Southern and Northern and England. So we had the same kind of thing. We had the reliability crisis, where every government minister in the cabinet, first thing they looked at in the morning was the PPM stats on their phone to see whether that was going to cause a problem in the media later that day. So it got really ludicrous. And the problem was it just became too politically difficult. And there was a great example a few years ago when there had been a kind of cluster of delay incidents, and one of them happened. There was a points failure or something outside or between Haymarket and Waverley. An hour before First Minister's questions one day, the entire railway went into meltdown, and the First Minister nearly lost it by saying, can we get a grip? This was a failure of the infrastructure, which is a reserved matter.
Yeah.
It wasn't to do with the operations in our franchise. So can we please actually understand how complex railway governance and devolution actually is? Because as we talked about earlier on, Network Rail remains reserved. The economic regulation of the system is reserved. The kind of franchise contract that was in place previously was still reserved. But then the operator, or the choice of operator more accurately, was a devolved responsibility given Transport Scotland had become the franchising authority. So my take, Scottish Government was getting lots of political pelters, to use the local vernacular, because of difficulties in the railway, which were systemic due to the structure of franchising and the way that the investment profile was working, and they'd had enough. However, you also have to give credit to the trade unions and the opposition parties, particularly the Labour Party. They realised this was an issue they could get some purchase on, and they pursued it diligently and vigorously. And when the rebasing of the franchise and the decision to extend Abellio's contract from 7 to 10 years came up, I think it was a fairly easy political choice for the government to say, actually, we'll take this back into public ownership. But again, as we'll talk about in a minute, big case of be careful what you wish for.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things I've said, certainly in the later years of the franchising system, which is obviously now entirely collapsed, in the earlier years, this maybe is a bit of an oversimplification, but in the later years where the DFT had total control over the way a franchise could operate, like almost no wriggle room for the way that a franchise could operate, those franchises essentially were the government outsourcing the blame for anything. They were paying a company to exist for them to blame for things, to be a bit of a shield against the heat of something going wrong, whether it was a Network Rail failure, as often it was, or whether it was a train operating company issue at all. And it's interesting that as soon as that shield stopped working, it immediately became politically expedient for the shift to happen, and that happened in Scotland. And then not too long afterwards, it's happened for the rest of GB as well.
Yeah, I agree with you, but one thing I would say is that the statements you hear about Scotland the Village or Scotland the Goldfish Bowl are true. And the political culture up here is different, and there are positives and negatives to this. So, positive side, and this is something that devolution has definitely brought, is that the level of accountability for the performance of public services that the Scottish administration has is really high, actually, in the public debate. The downside of that, well, let's not say the downside. One of the other facets of that, although I'd argue it's a downside because it gets in the way of strategy, is that every operational problem that happens in any public service instantly becomes the political issue of the day. So it becomes, First Minister, why is the 9:54 to Alloa late? First Minister, why is my brother's operation being cancelled? First Minister, why is the school classroom leaking? So the politics just become really parochial very quickly. And that is accountability in action, but it also makes it really hard to do strategy sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so with that said, and we've kind of led ourselves into it quite nicely, actually, the next question really is, right, so this has happened. What are the challenges that not just ScotRail, but Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government are now going to face? And I suppose I've got some kind of guide slides, because it's such a big question, really, and it'd be mean to just leave this slide up and ask you to go in head first. So I thought I'd kind of start with decarbonisation as a theme. To what extent is this a challenge now? Is this threatened by the change, or is it an opportunity? How is the idea of decarbonisation going to be influenced, and how is this? What does this shape?
So Scottish Government has gone for this big time, not just in the railways, but they make a thing about having more ambitious climate targets than the UK government. I think they mean it. And I think they mean it for two reasons. I think they mean it because they're signed up to the agenda, and of course they're bringing in the Greens to government after last year's election means that that's even more of a political priority for them. But I do think that they see investment in decarbonisation as being a way of creating high-skilled jobs that have to be in Scotland, because you can't electrify the railway network over the internet. So there's a bit of industrial strategy going on here as well, and it's not something that the current Scottish Government's done very well, actually. They've big story in the papers today about how much they've missed out on the jobs potential from the renewables revolution, and I think that's a fair critique, actually. So there's some realisation of that, and I think they're keen to make sure that doesn't happen again. It also, of course, is a nice way of rebalancing transport policy and spending money on things other than roads, which is what some ministers have decided to do.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Of course, we can talk about that all night as well. But it's definitely a way. It's definitely a way of maintaining capital investment in the railway network, when perhaps in typical transport econometrics terms, it's not the best place to put your money.
It's certainly an interesting one, isn't it? Because I often make the point with when it comes to decarbonisation, the most important thing, and electrification feeds this, but actually the most important thing is to just get people out of their cars, right? And actually electrifying the railway, whilst it allows you faster trains, lighter trains, cheaper trains to maintain, all this stuff, actually, arguably, it doesn't make as much difference as just enacting major policies.
No, it doesn't. And something else that's really interesting up here in a policy terms recently is that over the last 10 years, we've bundled up electrification schemes with really quite radical line improvements in some respects. So the E&G main line is the best example of that. But one that became politically controversial recently was the downgrading of the East Kilbride electrification project. So what Scottish Government's decided to do there is electrify the line, not redouble it, and not do some other capacity enhancements, because that was based on a business case that was about peak hour commuting that frankly no longer exists and isn't likely to come back soon. So they're pressing ahead with electrification, and I think we need to be pleased about that, because as I say, we're fortunate in Scotland that we've got probably a broader based transport appraisal system than the DFT has been operating, which is why we've done more reopenings and we've taken different decisions. And a lot of these schemes might not have survived if they were in England, but we're going to press ahead with them.
Yeah. Which actually neatly leads into the next slide, because, okay, that's decarbonisation, but what about, firstly, to a greater or lesser extent, the Greens plan and what the Greens said they wanted to do now that in their Rail for All plan, they're in government, they have control over large elements of transport. What does nationalisation of ScotRail mean for that? And then I suppose connecting to that, what does it mean for reopenings, for new lines, new stations? How do you think this change is going to alter that?
So reopenings cost money, right? Reopenings obviously have a capital cost, and we've known what's happened to capital costs of projects, but they also add to the ongoing revenue subsidy requirement. And in the recent Strategic Transport Projects Review 2, which was published, I'm not sure whether this quite made it into explicit text in the review, but essentially the Scottish Government's position is that the revenue requirement for the railways is huge. It's ballooned because of COVID as well. And we just can't afford to keep reopening lines that add to the revenue requirement. So, if you look at the Rail for All document, everybody would like more railway, right? We'd all like more railway. We'd especially like closed lines to reopen. In a sense, it's motherhood and apple pie, but we're all in favour of that. We all like more railway. Who's going to pay for it? And crucially, given the railways are now part of the Scottish budget, and remember, the devolved government has to have a balanced budget essentially every year. It can't just borrow to get its way out of a shortfall. A pound spent on the railway is a pound not spent on something else. And there isn't borrowing slack in the short term to make up for overspend. So the level of financial control the Scottish Government's got to impose on the system now is really quite tight. Now, I'm actually surprised that they've been able to sustain a position of as much revenue support for the system post-COVID as they have. Because in round terms, the amount of money that Scottish Government is spending on railways has doubled in about 5 years. Huge amount of the Scottish budget. It's up to something like 1.1% of GDP, I think now. So reopenings are really costly. And if you've got such an ambitious decarbonisation plan, and if the timescale is really important, which it is to the Scottish Government, and it is to carbon budgeting, then I'm afraid for the next cycle, we've got to decarbonise what we've got before we build any more.
How does that? I mean, it's a disappointing thing for lots of people on here to hear, I'm sure, but it is the pragmatic truth. This is the situation. To what extent are there two things that jump to my mind? One of them is that one thing electrification offers is a reduction in operating costs. It'd be interesting to understand to what extent that could offset, almost a bit of a kind of a revenue budget switcheroo there.
Well, listen, it will do, but not enough.
Not enough.
So
yeah.
The government. The decarbonisation plan you show is well aware of the ongoing revenue support reductions you get by operating a more efficient fleet, electrified or whatever. So, I mean, that's all baked in.
Yeah.
And that's why civil servants in Transport Scotland were able to convince ministers on the Scottish Exchequer function that this was the right thing to do. So, that's been won, and that's really good. And if you look at the map that you've got there, though, on the Rail for All document, these reopenings we're talking about are a bit like the Borders line, essentially. They're long rural routes. Long rural routes are really expensive, and if you were able to see the operating data about the per trip subsidy in some of the rural routes we've already got in Scotland, it is utterly eye-watering, and it is in that it would be cheaper to put everybody in a taxi territory. Yeah. And even the Borders Railway, which of course is seen as being this great success, its revenue requirement is much higher.
It's about 4 times higher
than was forecast.
Yeah.
And with the best will in the world, reopening routes in the northeast, the Buchan or whatever from Aberdeen, is going to make absolutely no difference to Scotland's net carbon output. The amount of modal ships you're going to get in Aberdeenshire, the home of the oil and gas industry, and 4x4s, it's not really a carbon priority. So there's a huge dose of realism required here. And as you say, it's obviously disappointing for people that want the reopening programme to continue and thought that their line was next, etc., etc. But, if we're serious about decarbonisation and getting the fiscal status of the industry under control, we've got to focus on fixing what we've got.
It is, and this is, and it's kind of, we'll kind of come to it shortly, actually. But yeah, in fact, I will hold off. The discussion about monetary sovereignty, I think, is one that we'll very briefly touch on. The next thing, possibly slightly more optimistic, is about urban transit in Scotland, and obviously one of the things that you champion is the Clyde Metro. Perhaps tell us very, very briefly. Tell us what this is and how likely it is you think this is going to be delivered in over the next sort of 10, 20 years, and how this again ties into ScotRail and a nationalised ScotRail.
Yeah, so I mean, I've been involved in quite a few initiatives to try and get government to take urban transport more seriously. So the devolved era, both administrations, has been largely about lots of really significant infrastructure investment in intercity transport, both the road network and more recently the rail network, and it's great. We had to catch up. There hadn't been a lot of that done before devolution, and the quality of the network and its capacity, etc., has improved remarkably over that period. So that's great. But we've done very little relatively to improve urban transport, and the new projects review recognises that. And it's not just about Glasgow. Importantly, in Edinburgh, it's really focused on substantive extensions to the tram network. Yeah. Great to see the SNP administration doing that, of course, because they tried to cancel it in 2007 when they came in. But that's another argument. Fortunately, it was won through political persuasion and circumstance. But nonetheless, so Edinburgh's lots of LRT expansion. Aberdeen, where lots of very high quality roads have been built recently, and also it's a very polycentric economy. The city centre isn't dominant in the employment market the way it is in the central belt cities. Quite ambitious bus rapid transit proposals there as well, so that's all great. In Glasgow, and then by that I mean the Glasgow City region, so that's a map of roughly 10 kilometres from the centre, more or less. It's that scale that's been ignored, and that scale in Glasgow and about what you do for the transport network has been a thing in political debate since, ironically, the nationalisation of the British Transport Commission in 1947, which is when projects like the extension of the subway, because they were the trams, because they were controlled by local government, were kiboshed, to use another great example of the local vernacular. So, what you do about transport in the Glasgow metropolitan area has been an issue for a long time. The Metro was about two things. One, Glasgow still has the lowest car ownership just about of any major metropolitan area in the UK. It does, however, have massively high car use for its ownership.
Interesting.
So there's lots of informal car sharing going on. We suffer from bad planning mistakes still, where housing, for decades was built in the wrong place. So it's a very car-dominated economy. Yeah. If we're going to meet carbon emissions, this is what we've got to fix in Scotland. This is where those emissions are going to be made. To do that, in short term, we've got this rail infrastructure, much of which is very old. It's often said that Glasgow has the third oldest underground railway in the world, the subway. If you count the low-level route under Queen Street, which of course looks a lot like the Metropolitan line in London, it would actually be the second oldest subway in the world, if you thought of that as a subway and not a railway. So we've got this infrastructure which is old, needs radical reform, but by and large is actually in the right place. And there's lots of dormant bits of the network. So a lot of those lines that you see there are actually reopenings of things that closed, in some cases, long before beaching. So the northwest quadrant, the thin orange line, is the reopening of a route which closed to passenger traffic in the First World War. But it serves some of the most densely populated parts of the UK. So there's a lot you can do with this network. We reckon that we can probably get about 4 times as many passengers on it as are there today if you make the right decisions and you save bucket loads of carbon, and you make the long-term financial position of the network much more sustainable as well. So it's a really clever project. It's been around in various forms for a long time, and this is its latest one. I don't think there's been political commitment to doing this in this kind of way before. Let's see where the rhetoric is translated into action.
So one of the things I'm thinking with this is that yes, this would challenge the hegemony of heavy rail, but actually, perhaps this is a benefit of ScotRail being nationalised, is that you can get the cross-pollinisation revenue-wise in a way that you couldn't if it. Is there a benefit there actually? Because
I don't know. I think the continuing non-devolution of the Network Rail is going to be much more problematic here.
Okay, yeah.
Because if we're into actually converting existing routes into metro, which is what the thick orange lines are about there as part of the core of the network, that opens up all of those really thorny governance and revenue questions again. So that could yet be problematic. It must be said, however, that two things. One, there is a more detailed version of that map that exists with some options for what might actually be the projects that we do rather than the proof of concept which that map shows. Before anybody gets excitable, it's probably not FOIable because it's advice to ministers, so you won't get a hold of it. But there is lots of thinking that's going on about it, and Network Rail have been a really important part of doing that. And they're really up for this. They're not precious about whether it remains their infrastructure or not, and they're fully signed up to the project, which is about making a proper rapid transit network for the metropolitan area work and get people out of cars.
Oh, that's fantastic. That is good to hear. And very reassuring. There's lots of... Glasgow is it already has fantastic... it's funny, isn't it? It has fantastic... It has an excellent urban and suburban rail network, but it sounds like it's still not used much.
So my local station is 3 minutes scamper down the hill in the morning, or 4 minutes puff up the way. So if you're like me, if you live in a prosperous suburb that grew up with the railway, and round the corner you can see some of the original railway villas that really did grow up with the railway, we've actually got European level public transport. A lot of my fellow Glaswegians don't, and of course they're the people that are most deprived parts of the city, have least access to jobs, particularly those jobs that are not in the city centre, that have grown up in new kind of zones of economic activity. So a lot of what you see here is about actually trying to make inclusive growth work in a transport sense, and extending the fixed public transport network to parts of the city that need it most but don't have it.
And it's a familiar story in places like Manchester as well, because Manchester has decent suburban rail in a few quarters, but again, those are the ones that still remain are in traditionally more affluent areas, partly because the railway's been there the whole time. There's this bit of a feedback loop, and actually the areas that are more deprived rely on buses, and the buses are dreadful in Manchester. They're very expensive anyway. They might be reasonably high density, and I think the story's similar in Glasgow. The buses are not great, and the cost of the buses is quite high.
I think if you were to find somebody who called them not great, you'd be doing well.
Yeah, yes, that's been very polite. Okay, so that's the way that urban transit networks are going to grow. So we touched on this. Network Rail. How the hell does ScotRail's privatisation tie in with Network Rail? And I suppose a little bit back to how the hell GBR will then tie into this as well. All unknown, I suppose.
Well, this is fun, isn't it? So, in practical terms, that Abilio, when they did for the franchise bid for a deep alliance, and didn't end up being quite as deep as it was originally going to be in the original iterations of franchise, but nonetheless, it's an alliance that exists, and it still exists. So in Scotland Railway, the overarching brand that still exists for the moment, is an alliance of public sector ScotRail operating company, ScotRail Trains, and Network Rail. So let's see how that happens. Interestingly, and I will try and choose my words very carefully here to make sure I reflect what's in the public domain, Network Rail is relaxed about devolution because they see operational devolution as something that's been advantageous to the operation of the company. And if you want, there is no better example of that than what's happened to the price of electrification in Scotland because we've been doing more of it. It's now about £2 million per track kilometre, and that's £1 million less than it is in England. So it's beginning to make real operational differences. I don't think Network Rail would have had a problem with legislative devolution of railway infrastructure to the Scottish Parliament. Their operations here are set up that I think they could cope with that quite easily. So I don't think there's a kind of industry political pushback. It's become a completely toxic issue between the two governments. The Scottish Government has asked at times politely and at times less politely for devolution of Network Rail to occur, and the DfT, particularly under Shapps, has said no. And for obvious reasons that undermines the whole GBR prospectus, as it were. So
Union Connectivity
the
Review,
railways are
GBR.
still in the front line of the constitutional debate in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that then ties into the last point, which is about Treasury, about Treasury's grip, but also about monetary sovereignty. And I suppose it's worth, perhaps, I'm conscious we're going to, hopefully you don't mind a little overrun, sorry Ian, but it's worth kind of pointing out the issue with Westminster benefits from being able to borrow from itself, essentially, via the Bank of England. Scotland, the Scottish Government, do not have that function. They do not have their own sovereign currency. So I don't know whether you want to touch on that briefly and how that might influence things. And you've already talked about the fact that, I think you were pointing out that a driver and a senior nurse are on a similar salary, and there are questions like that previously wouldn't exist, that perhaps aren't questions that are so important in Westminster, actually. And I make the case for the fact that it is not so important. Unfortunately, I can't make the same case in Scotland because it doesn't work like that, frankly. Scotland does not have monetary sovereignty. So maybe you want to talk briefly on that and other challenges of Treasury.
Yes, I mean, let's not open up another 3 hours debate about what would happen to the railways under more constitutional reform and independence and currency change and all that. The reality is that the administration currently has very limited borrowing powers, and they can only borrow for capital. And from memory, it's something like 500 million a year. So I mean, it's really not
trivial.
A big amount of money in the grander scheme of things. So it operates on a fixed budget, and it's obliged by law to balance that budget every year. And notwithstanding further constitutional change that may happen in the future, whatever that is, that's a really tight fiscal envelope or discipline for the industry to have to operate under. And so, this is the thing about ScotRail coming into the public sector that I don't think has been fully understood by many people that advocated for it. It means that the expectations in terms of what the industry delivers for public investment are now even higher than they were before. And that will feed through to issues about, why do we employ this many people on the railway when we could do with more nurses or spend money on something else? So, the railway community has traditionally argued about the redistribution of funds within the transport budget. Spend less on roads because we need to get people out of the car, spend it on the railway. Not like that anymore. Spend more money on railways, you spend less on hospitals, and that's a truism.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that the industry is ready for that, because that's a level of day-to-day political scrutiny about the value for money that we get from the industry, which we just haven't had in decades and never under the devolved era in Scotland. And I actually think that's going to be quite healthy. It's going to be very difficult, but I think it's going to be healthy, but it'll be bumpy as we adjust to that.
Yeah, it's an argument I absolutely agree. It's the reality is that the same money was being spent, right? Like, it's not like there's suddenly, when the shift happened, there wasn't suddenly a massive change in the amount of money being spent. It's just that it's now all on the books for everyone to scrutinise in as much detail as they wish to. And yeah, likewise, like for me, I advocate, I believe in the fact that railways should be state operated, but I'm under no illusions that scrutiny, whilst it's a good thing, that scrutiny can and will be painful for a lot of people in the industry.
The one thing that's changed slightly, actually, is the level of risk that was transferred to the operator, right? And that was never very much. But the pay settlement was always a bit of an aspect of risk for the incumbent, and it was managed by the incumbent talk and all the rest of it. That's now brought into the public sector pay bargaining system as well. So, difficult things will happen as a result of that, and I've no doubt we'll see that in the first round.
Yeah.
One thing we should have said actually in the intro about privatisation is that one of the other theoretical justifications, of course, for privatisation was that it effected a transfer of risk from the public sector to the private sector. So we kind of learned with Railtrack that wasn't true.
Yeah,
we've certainly learned with COVID that isn't true.
Yeah.
So the justification for privatisation on that basis, that private sector is better at understanding risk, better at finding the right risk appetite and delivering public value or benefit because of that. That's gone forever.
Yeah, that's something that government can no longer kind of hide behind, really. Well, that very neat, that incredible. It's almost as if you're a professional at this. The last little question, which will be very quick, is it's a quick one, and it's just putting up the nice old ScotRail regional railways branding there, which actually is quite. See, I don't mind if a little double arrow appears here and there on the ScotRail liveries. I think that's fine. A little white double arrow, that's fine. But don't go further than that. Whoever might be in charge of that. Sorry, I'm digressing. The question is, Iain, do you think it'll be successful? Do you think this is going to be generally okay? There are challenges, but do you think it's going to be good news for Scotland?
So, I can't resist the chance to start by talking about branding again. I think you'll find some GBR branding on those little spaces in the doors that used to have the operator branding. I think it'll be not a political battle worth having to add some red to the livery that we've got. Will it be successful? It's important to say that the ScotRail network is in better shape than it's ever been. Right? If I were to take my local train from here into central Glasgow and then go to Edinburgh or Stirling, for example, I would always think I was in a real functioning European railway. Nice, nice trains, comfortable, modern, clean, quick, electric, good stations. It's really not bad. Let's be honest, it's in a really good state. So, of course, it'll be successful. It does, however, cost a hell of a lot of money to the public purse. And I just don't think that's sustainable politically, given the overall fiscal outlook. Whatever happens to Scotland's constitutional status over the next few years, I don't think that's politically sustainable. I think we're going to have really difficult questions about how much this costs, whether we get value for money. And, in England, you already see that with the Treasury 15% letter, for example. We've avoided that this round in Scotland, but it's coming. And ScotRail employs a lot of people. The first franchise renewal of First Group, in many respects, was an economic development decision, which was about creating employment and building up the industry. But we've got a lot of people in the industry in Scotland. In many ways, it's a traditional railway. It's a heavy rail network.
Yeah.
We haven't done smart ticketing very well. We haven't done a lot of those other things that lots of European networks will have done. So I think sooner or later, that's going to be the real crunch question. And then that, of course, opens up, and rightly so in many respects, some really tricky industrial relations questions. How many people does this thing going to employ in future? Doing what kinds of jobs? How are we going to reward them? What's their job tenure and security going to be like if they're public sector employees? That could be good. In Scotland, we've got a no compulsory redundancies assumption still. But that combination of the scale of financial resources that's directed to the industry, and in many respects, and I'm again too tired to think of a more diplomatic phrase, old-fashioned operating culture in many respects. At some point, that's going to come to a crunch.
It's there are opportunities, but this is not just going to be a land of sort of strawberries and chocolates. It's going to be some bumpy roads ahead, or bumpy tracks, should we say? Iain, that's been brilliant. It's been so good. I'm going to do my outro bits, but we'll come back to you briefly. But that's been a really fascinating kind of exploration of the whole picture. I think really nicely. Everyone, send your questions in. We'll do questions. But are you all right, Iain, for another 5 minutes? Are you not
absolutely.
having to run? Yeah, good stuff. Send your questions in. Make sure you at me. Everyone in the chat. Hello, everyone in the chat. I have been watching. Put the at us in, and we'll ask Iain some questions. First, though. This is available on all good podcasting platforms, and so will last week's be when I upload both of them probably tomorrow at some point. Yes, thanks for listening, everyone. Shout out to all of those listening in without the pictures. I don't know how you manage it, but it seems to work. The next thing is patreon.com/Gareth Dennis to make more of this happen. The merchandise, particularly we definitely need to abolish the Treasury mugs. Buy those. There's going to be a crowdfunding effort to get everyone in Treasury sent one of those mugs. So that's going to be good. I'm joking, but I'm only half joking. Masket.co.uk/collection/railnatter for those. PayPal.me/Gareth Dennis if you want to throw abuse at me, you can do so, but it costs you. And GarethDennis.co.uk/Discord is where the chat that's been happening continues in perpetuum, where there are, I think, like 700+ plus, maybe 750 people all chatting very politely to each other about railways and transport policy. It's brilliant in there. You're all lovely. Shout out to all of you in there, because the admin team and me have to do essentially no managing of that discussion because everyone's so lovely. So you're all great. So that's all that. A plug for Iain, actually. And actually, it's a bit of a plug for a future episode, because Iain, yourself, Thynos, Gillian and Greg have all been working on this paper about the changing travel patterns in the post-pandemic society, which is just immensely fascinating. It's an incredibly interesting paper. And you said actually there's an update coming, or some of the work related to it is being updated.
Yeah, so one of the core data set that underpins it all is a household survey. We started out with about 9,500 households across Great Britain. I'm pleased, Mr. Chaps. 10 regions, 5 in Scotland, 5 in England, from memory. And thank you to our sponsors who boosted the sample to let that happen in particular places. But we've been asking people right from the first lockdown about what's happened to their travel habits and how they've been changing. And so we are about to start the 4th wave of that in about 4 or 5 weeks. So that's the only longitudinal study of people's changing habits that we've got. And it's essentially a kind of travel diary type methodology, a bit more complex than that, but that's what it is. So it gives us behavioural insights that the account data that you get for different modes don't really reveal. So already some really interesting things about motivations. And in that report in particular, that was out a few weeks ago, we tried to unpick some of the claims that you might read in the media about what's really happening, but we can't find any evidence for.
Yep.
Like, for example, people have not been buying more cars, nor have they been using them more, really.
So is this going to reflect? So when you've got that updated data, will that be reflected in an updated paper or a revised paper, or will it be a new set of academic works?
That's the second of the kind of annual reports. So we published one on the anniversary of lockdown first time, and that was almost exactly 2 years in. So we'll probably do another one of those in 12 months' time. But there are other publications that the four of us are doing, which will get some of that data out before next March.
Fantastic. So everyone look that up, because it is fantastic. It's honestly very, very interesting, and it's burst some of my perceptions. Things that I was being led to believe with, frankly, a limited view of data. It's been really good to have some of that burst, and from my understanding to be advanced greatly by the work here. It's really good stuff. Really, really good stuff. In other plugs, what is the next? I can't even remember what my next plug is. Yes, that's right. Last night I was talking Rail Future. I think this is a recording that's available. So if you want to watch, related to what Iain and I were talking about, how the Integrated Rail Plan lets Yorkshire down, it was quite a good session, and the Q&A session afterwards was really, really good. My little half hour was pretty... You'll have all seen that me rant on about this stuff before, but actually the Q&A afterwards was really good. It was really interesting. We talked about the democratisation of transport. We talked about how people are have less of a voice now, and it's certainly in GB more broadly, certainly in England. It was really interesting. So if you want to go and find that, you can email the event organisers probably to get a copy of the recording if it's not going to be put on YouTube or something after that. And I think the next thing I'm going to play is a video. So me and Iain are going to watch this video for 2 minutes because it's a plug from a friend of the show.
Is the red light means he's on?
Yes, that's it.
Right, okay. We're professional. Hello, I'm Tim Dunn.
Oh, that was nice.
Well, thank you very much.
and I'm Fran Scott.
And we're here at the Brunel Museum to ask you for your help.
Yes, now I'm a trustee here at the Brunel Museum.
I live locally, and frankly, I've got a big top hat.
Now the Brunel... I can't get over that. Now the Brunel Museum is built on top of the Thames Tunnel, which was of course built by Mark Brunel, his son Isambard Kingdom, and their team of engineers. And it was the first ever tunnel under a big river.
6 takes that's taken. This museum is an incredible place for a wonderful collection of wonderful objects relating to the Brunels and this tunnel.
But one, or more to the point, 30 things are missing.
Yeah, 30 remarkable pieces of art.
Now, these are watercolours, some of which are drawn by the hand of Mark and his son, Isambard Kingdom, showing the development and the actual construction of the Thames Tunnel. And they show this era of engineering drawing that is almost an art form. They are beautiful. Some of them are isometric drawings, so that's a way to show an engineering drawing with dimensions which normal perspective drawing wouldn't be able to convey.
and they're not on display.
No, and you can't just stick them up with some blue tack. What we need is a curatorial grade display case, and for that we need your help.
Yeah, we need some money, £18,500.
So throughout April we are running a crowdfunding campaign.
A couple of quid, please, if you can afford it.
Yeah, or 20.
Or maybe even 30.
Yeah, or if you give us 100, then you can receive a print of one of these watercolours.
Really?
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
And all you've got to do is go to
www.thebrunelmuseum.com/artfund.
Go on, click on it now.
Oh, please, go and click. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed.
There you go. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tim and Fran, friends of the show.
Serious face. Dead puppies. That's how you get a serious face, by thinking of dead puppies. How do you get your serious face?
I think about trains and scrapyards. Thomas the Tank Engine dying. Oh.
There we go. Thanks, Tim and Fran. Thanks for waiting for that, Ian. Yeah, go support the crowdfunding if you're interested in that sort of thing. Ties into one of our previous episodes about technical drawing, actually. It's good. Next week's episode is about Network Rail's modular design for small and medium stations. It's going to be a pre-record, first one in a while, because I can't remember why. I think I'm doing shenanigans of some kind. But that's next week. Oh, Ian, I'm going to bring you back. Thanks for pausing there, having a sip of tea or whatever. We have several questions. And we're going to be quick, so we're going to take minutes to do these questions. Less. We've got 2.5 minutes, and we're going to go through these. Michael Booth asks, what can ScotRail do now that they couldn't do before April the 1st?
Nothing.
Nothing. There you go. It's a quick and easy question to answer. No, it's quick fire. It's a quick fire round. Ryan Hogg is asking, does ScotRail end at the Scottish border or overlap to Newcastle and Carlisle?
It certainly gets as far as Carlisle. The status of what happens as far as Newcastle is something I'm not quite sure these days, but I think when the new stations of East Lothian open, that there is a plan to run increased numbers of local or regional trains between Edinburgh and Newcastle, which will be ScotRail services, although I would need to go away to check that.
Yeah, see, I thought it was potentially going to all be TransPennine services running in those. But I'd have to go away and check that. I don't fully know. So yeah, question mark on that one. David Shepherd, can any Scottish reopen railway project create an alternate route that reduces disruption of electrification closures? I think I can answer that. It's probably not. The cost of building a diversion route, even if it involves just a couple of little corners of reopening, are just not. If you talk about the South Sub. Oh yeah, South Sub reinstatement. Do you think that's going to happen? Do you think even that's precluded by the reappearance of
the South Sub is like Glasgow Crossrail. It's one of these projects that people look at railway and go, "Oh look, there's a railway. It should have stations on it." Except there is no case to have passenger stations on it whatsoever, because the bus. So the geography. It's like a flattened oval.
Yeah.
So people think they can get the train from down here in posh South Edinburgh and arrive at Waverley. But actually, the distance you travel is 4 or 5 times it would be if you just got a bus in a straight line. So where the South Sub is really, really interesting is in creating freight capacity and the resilience of the passenger network in the net of Waverley, and reliability of Haymarket to Waverley. So it probably will happen for network management reasons, but passenger stations, no, can't see it. Sorry.
Yeah.
You have more tram down there anyway. Tram's the more.
I was going to say, I've always said if you are going to do stuff for the South Sub, I think tying it into tram train type operations is probably a sensible use of that infrastructure. If you do want to tie certain elements of it in,
still in the wrong place.
It is. It's the wrong axis. Really, people don't really travel that way in Edinburgh. I lived in Edinburgh for 5 years.
It's best example. The best allegory is probably Petit Saint-Ours in Paris. So it's the same kind of route, and it's also. Most of it's really inaccessible because the vertical elevation is really different from the street level around where it is. So in accessibility terms, it's a nightmare as well. No, sorry, can't see it.
Yeah, they're very expensive stations to build if you were going to do it, and so on and so forth. Okay, Gareth Williams, what is the collective opinion of the effect of Labour's threat to renationalise BR if they were to win or GBR if they were to win the next election? Well, I think that's fallen away as a threat with the current Labour Party, but. Ian, I don't know if you've got thoughts on that.
That hasn't registered up here at all.
Yeah, rightly so. Gregor McCabery asks, should we be more hopeful than fearful about the newly nationalised ScotRail, or will there be yet more cutbacks? I suppose we've kind of half answered that, but I don't know if you've got any are you more hopeful than fearful, Iain?
It's too early to tell.
Okay, yeah.
Noises I hear from people who know inside the industry up here tell me that they are relatively optimistic about what might be able to be done on both the revenue side and cost reduction side, so that they can present a picture to the government that's not too scary. But, as we said, it's back to the point you made earlier on about the macro trends out there are the ones that matter.
Yeah.
Energy crisis, folks, cost of living crisis, and God knows where this horrendous war is going to end up. And these are really, really big impacts on everything and everybody, of which the Scottish budget is some part. So, there is no hiding place now. It's fully part of public spending. It's accounted for on the same basis as every other public service every year in the annual Scottish budget. So that's a pretty bright light of accountability.
Yeah.
ScotRail, to be fair, have said that the reduced timetable we've got here is a starting point, and they don't expect to cut anything, and they want to build back from it. And we've only gone back to the kind of service levels that we had in 2015, 2016. So although we're running less than before the pandemic, we were trying to run too many trains and infrastructure that couldn't cope with it, frankly. It's not as if we've gone back to a timetable which is drastically reduced. I mean, there are some lines that have got meaningful reductions, of which mine is one, and off-peak we've gone to half hourly rather than 15-minute. But at a network level, it's not dreadful if we can stay at this position.
Yeah. I, to be honest, I think that's a neat place for us to draw a line under it. Actually, that kind of that view. Jamie's asked some questions about papers for macro effects, but I think what to do is probably tweet Iain that. You can find Iain on Twitter. Iain, I'm throwing you in it. People are now going to start atting you for paper references like there's no tomorrow. Jamie, go to Twitter, find Iain on there.
That's fine. I'll just remember to tweet about politics and red wine for the duration and see if that does the business.
That's it, Iain. This has been an absolute pleasure. Really, I think that's been a really interesting and broad, but also quite targeted discussion of the subject. It's been brilliant. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. Everyone, thanks in the chat for joining as well. It's been great. It's been a really interesting episode. About 100 of you were joining for a while, which is good. Some nice numbers. Iain, it only really remains for us both to sort of say goodbye to everyone. So yeah, I think cheerio from both of us. Cheerio, everyone. Cheerio.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.